Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into a concept that's, well, really relevant right now. Geopolitical musical chairs.
Yeah, that's Doug Casey's phrase, isn't it? From that conversation he had with Matt Smith.
Exactly. It describes this constant shuffling of global influence. Countries trying to grab a better seat when the music stops.
It's a great metaphor. And we get to hear Casey and Smith break down some specific hotspots.
Right. So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from their chat, understand the strategies in this game, and see what it means for the bigger picture.
And try not to get lost in the weeds. Keep it focused.
Okay, let's jump right in then. First stop, Greenland. This huge island popped up in the news, remember, with this kind of surprising idea that the U.S. might want to buy it.
Yeah, that was unexpected. Casey sees that through a pretty specific lens. He frames it as almost corporate-style thinking applied to geopolitics.
Corporate thinking, like expanding assets.
Exactly. Like the U.S. is a company looking to add to its portfolio. A very transactional view of how nations interact.
Which is interesting because, the U.S. already has a big footprint there, right? Thule Air Base isn't new.
Not at all. That's been a key strategic spot for a long time. And you're right, there's been more talk lately about U.S. activity, surveillance, interest in the Arctic generally.
So the military presence is there. But then there's this unique land situation in Greenland.
All land is owned communally. That's a major hurdle for any straightforward purchase.
Yeah, you can't just buy it like a piece of real estate. Casey flags that as a big complication, right?
Definitely. It involves huge legal, cultural, practical obstacles. It's not simple.
And this brings up another point. Denmark provides a lot of financial support to Greenland. Billions, apparently.
Somewhere between $5 and $10 billion a year, according to the article. It's significant.
So Casey floats this idea, maybe a bit provocative, that Denmark might actually be relieved if the U.S. took over to get out from under that cost.
It's certainly a thought-provoking angle. Purely financially, maybe it makes sense for Denmark, but, history, culture, national pride. It's way more complicated than just money.
Sure. Now, what about the resources? Minerals are often mentioned as the big prize in Greenland.
Right. That's always part of the conversation. But Casey kind of pushes back on that.
Oh, how so?
Well, his argument is basically that minerals are global commodities. If you need them, you can usually buy them on the open market. International law covers access. U.S. companies can already operate there.
So if it's not primarily about minerals, what does he think is driving the interest?
He leans more towards military positioning, locking down strategic Arctic locations, and what he calls psychological imperialism.
Psychological imperialism.
Yeah, like projecting power, making your presence felt, shaping how things are perceived, even without direct ownership. Influence, basically.
Okay, interesting. Let's shift gears now. Panama. That feels like a place with a much longer, maybe more tangled history with the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. Panama's split from Colombia. Well, Casey points out the U.S. basically engineered that whole thing.
To build the canal, right?
Exactly. It was all about securing the route for the Panama Canal. Casey's blunt phrase was, the U.S. bought everything.
That really says something about the power dynamic back then.
It does, a huge imbalance. The U.S. saw the canal as vital, economically and militarily, and, well, made it happen.
And now fast forward, and you've got Chinese companies controlling key ports there.
Right, companies like Hutchison Whampoa. And that's definitely making Washington nervous, raising suspicions about influence and control.
And there was even talk, especially under Trump, about maybe reacquiring the canal zone. It feels like this pattern of looking back at old imperial ideas.
It does fit that theme, and Casey brings in something else here, referencing Michael Yon's research.
What's that?
The idea that some folks in Colombia still resent losing Panama, that there's maybe even a lingering desire to, quote, retake Panama.
Wow. So those historical wounds are still there, potentially influencing things today.
Decades later, yeah. It shows how long these geopolitical ripples can last.
Okay, moving on again. Let's go to the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. A really unique relationship with the U.S., especially financially.
Unique is right. The numbers are pretty staggering. Over $21 billion a year flows from the U.S. to the island. Direct payments, grants, loans, contracts.
And Casey's take is pretty direct, calling it a socialist welfare state.
That's his description, yeah. He frames it as a significant fiscal liability for the U.S. taxpayer.
But then you have these pockets, like Dorado, attracting wealthy Americans because of specific tax laws.
Right.
Act 20, Act 22.
Exactly. Those laws create major tax incentives, basically zero capital gains tax, very low business taxes for people who relocate.
They were meant to boost the economy, right?
Yeah.
But are controversial.
Highly
Yeah.
controversial. They aim to attract investment, but the debate is huge about whether they actually work for the island overall or just benefit a few, creating these, well, tax havens.
And Casey's point is that without these loopholes, Puerto Rico's economy would be in serious trouble.
That's his argument. He suggests there isn't enough local industry, too much reliance on imports, and these tax breaks are kind of artificially propping things up.
Which then leads to this pretty radical suggestion from him and Smith. Maybe the U.S. should just let Puerto Rico go independent.
Right. It's the flip side of the acquisition coin we saw with Greenland. Here, the argument is purely economic.
If it's seen mainly as a financial burden, then maybe cutting ties makes fiscal sense for the U.S.
That seems to be the logic presented in their discussion, yeah. A very different perspective.
Okay, let's turn now to a region with much more immediate and nuclear dangers,
Yeah.
India and Pakistan.
Yeah, definitely one of the most dangerous flashpoints. The article mentions that recent flare-up in Kashmir.
Where both sides claimed they shot down fighter jets.
Exactly. It's just the latest round in a conflict that goes way back to the partition in 1947. The history there is incredibly deep and bitter.
And you have the added complexity of India's large Muslim minority, about 100 million people, living under Modi's Hindu nationalist government.
That adds huge layers of tension, both inside India and in its relationship with Pakistan. Casey uses the term deep-rooted hatred.
And he stresses the nuclear risk is real.
Very real. He doesn't mince words about how dangerous that situation is. It's a genuine concern.
Plus, China's in the mix too, backing Pakistan.
Right. China supports Pakistan, especially in those disputed Himalayan areas, partly as a counterweight to India. So it's not just India-Pakistan, it's this three-way tension.
A triangular dynamic that just raises the stakes even higher.
Precisely. More players, more potential for miscalculation, more risk of escalation.
So zooming out from these specific examples, Casey has some broader criticisms about overall U.S. strategy, doesn't he? About America's role globally.
He does. He's very critical of what he calls imperial overreach, this idea that the U.S. gets involved everywhere, often justified by an ever-expanding idea of national security.
And he points to the military budget as proof. Nearly $1 trillion a year.
Yeah, that staggering figure. Plus, he mentions the building of new military infrastructure, suggesting it looks like gearing up for something big, almost like the mobilization during World War II.
It's interesting, his take on Trump in this context. Trump talked free markets, but Casey sees his actions differently.
He points out the irony. The free market rhetoric versus what Casey calls a big government militarist reality, huge defense spending, interest in acquiring territory. It seems contradictory.
And sticking with Trump for a second, that comment about the U.S. winning World War II, Casey had a strong reaction to that.
He did. He offered a pretty sharp historical correction.
Emphasizing the Soviet Union's role.
Yes, pointing out the massive Soviet sacrifices and their absolutely crucial part in defeating Nazi Germany. He noted U.S. losses, while significant, were much lower than Soviet losses.
And he called that kind of rewriting of history dangerous and disrespectful.
Strong words, yeah. It highlights how important getting history right is, especially when you're talking about war and global strategy. Misunderstanding the past can lead to really bad decisions.
So pulling all these threads together, the picture Casey and Smith paint is, well, pretty grim. Ticking global powder kegs, Casey calls them.
He does. He points specifically to Russia-Ukraine, Israel-Hamas, and India-Pakistan as places where things could spiral badly if de-escalation fails, especially with this rise of muscular nationalism he mentions.
So across these different places, Greenland, Panama, Puerto Rico in reverse, India, Pakistan, you see these recurring themes.
Yeah, it's this constant tension, isn't it, between like economic interests, strategic positioning, old historical baggage, national pride.
It's not just about grabbing land anymore, maybe. It's about influence, access.
Or sometimes just stopping someone else from gaining an edge. It's complex.
So the big takeaways from this deep dive seem to be around the U.S., maybe acting like a modern empire, sometimes making short-sighted moves.
That's certainly Casey's perspective, and also how emotion and ego seem to be playing a bigger role in these geopolitical decisions.
Plus this persistent, almost old-fashioned idea that grabbing territory is still a valid play in the 21st century.
Exactly. It really makes you question what's driving international relations today. Is it all cold, hard strategy and economics? Or are there, deeper, maybe more irrational forces involved?
So as we wrap up this look at geopolitical musical chairs, we've touched on Greenland, Panama, Puerto Rico, India, Pakistan. Quite a tour. It makes you think about what's really behind these power shifts.
Is it strategy, money, history, ego? Probably a mix of everything.
And given how connected everything is and the potential for things to escalate that we've talked about, well, it leaves you with a big question. How do we, individuals and nations, navigate this time of shifting global power? Definitely something to chew on.